What we witnessed on the streets of Minneapolis this morning was not a tragic accident, not a misunderstanding, not a regrettable escalation in a tense moment, but an outright killing carried out by federal officers acting under the authority of the United States government, and it must be named plainly for what it was: a state-sanctioned act of lethal violence that demands accountability rather than excuses, a moment that forces a nation to confront an uncomfortable and terrifying truth about how power is now being exercised in America. Because when armed agents of the federal government shoot and kill a civilian in broad daylight, and the reflexive response from those in power is justification rather than restraint, deflection rather than investigation, loyalty rather than law, we are no longer discussing policy disagreements or partisan skirmishes, but the erosion of the most basic democratic principles. And this is why the reaction from Seth Moulton, a Marine veteran and sitting congressman from Massachusetts, landed with such force, because it was not calibrated, not poll-tested, not softened for political convenience, but raw, direct, and rooted in lived experience, the kind of moral clarity that feels almost shocking in a political culture that has trained itself to speak in euphemisms. And when Moulton stood there and called those icy officers cowards, unprofessional, pathetic cowards, he was not engaging in rhetorical excess, but drawing a stark comparison that should haunt every American who understands the rules of engagement. Because as he made painfully clear, if an 18-year-old Marine had done the same thing in Iraq, in the chaos of a war zone, that Marine would face a court-martial, because the act would be recognized as murder, and the fact that such behavior is now being normalized on American streets under the banner of law enforcement should alarm anyone who still believes that the United States is governed by laws rather than by fear, and the imagery alone tells its own story. Federal agents wearing masks, hiding their faces, operating like an occupying force rather than public servants, unable or unwilling to subdue a single individual without resorting to lethal force. And that is why Moulton's condemnation cuts so deep, because it stripped away the mythology and exposed the reality that this is not strength but weakness, not order but panic, not professionalism but brutality cloaked in authority. And when he said aise needs to be prosecuted, not merely reformed or reviewed or quietly funded through another continuing resolution, he was articulating what so many Americans are thinking, but so few elected officials are willing to say aloud, that an agency that operates without accountability, that kills with impunity, that answers only to political loyalty rather than constitutional constraint, has crossed a line from enforcement into criminality. And when he directly addressed the acting director of ICE, making it clear that this was not abstract criticism but a direct accusation from one Marine to another supposed authority figure, the message was unmistakable. Power does not absolve guilt, and wearing a badge does not place you above the law. And this moment did not emerge in isolation, but within a broader conversation hosted by Ken Harbaugh of the Midas Touch Network. A conversation that itself underscores the gravity of the moment, because Harbaugh did not present Moulton as a partisan, firebrand, but as someone known for saying the uncomfortable thing early, someone who warned years ago about Donald Trump's authoritarian impulses when it was still politically inconvenient to do so, someone whose reputation has been built not on chasing applause, but on refusing to wait for permission to speak. And that is why Harbaugh's plea, "We need more of this kind of fire from our elected representatives," felt less like commentary and more like a desperate appeal, because what is unfolding now cannot be met with cautious language or strategic silence. And even the framing of the interview itself speaks volumes, because it was originally scheduled to discuss Greenland and Trump's increasingly unhinged rhetoric toward foreign territories and populations. Yet the killing in Minneapolis forced an immediate pivot, a recognition that domestic authoritarianism now demands urgent attention, that what is happening inside America can no longer be treated as background noise while pundits debate foreign policy abstractions. And as Moulton joined the conversation, the first question cut straight to the heart of the matter. Is the mood in Congress shifting? Is there any sign that this will lead to real change? Or are we trapped in a cycle of outrage without consequence? And his answer was as sobering as it was direct, because while there is outrage, it exists almost entirely on one side of the aisle, while Republicans, he said bluntly, are cowed into silence, trapped by fear of their own base, unwilling to speak truth, even when they privately acknowledge that what happened was wrong. And this, Moulton argued, is how democracies die, not only through overt repression, but through the quiet abdication of moral responsibility by those elected to represent the people. And when he described what we are witnessing as state-sponsored terror, he was not engaging in hyperbole, but drawing a historical parallel that demands serious reflection, because he spoke of Iran, of North Korea, of the regimes we teach our children to fear. And then he said the unthinkable, that we are now seeing echoes of Nazi Germany on American streets. And it is precisely this comparison that critics rush to dismiss as inflammatory, yet Moulton has been making this warning for years, long before it became fashionable, and when pressed on the argument that calling aise America's Gestapo somehow provokes violence. His response was scathing in its simplicity, because silence, he argued, does not prevent authoritarianism. It enables it, and the real danger lies not in speaking too loudly, but in allowing the abnormal to become normalized. And this normalization, he warned, is being actively manufactured by right-wing media ecosystems that present brutality as necessity, repression as security, and dissent as treason. And when he turned to the question of hypocrisy, particularly around guns, his frustration was palpable, because the same voices that endlessly invoke the Second Amendment suddenly fall silent when a civilian exercising those rights is disarmed and killed by the state. And if hypocrisy mattered, Moulton suggested, much of this would stop, but it no longer does, because accountability itself has become partisan. And the anecdote he shared about a Republican colleague crystallized the problem with devastating clarity. Because here was a lawmaker with decades of law enforcement experience who privately admitted that a woman should not have been killed, who recognized the injustice in real time, and yet who confessed that he could never say so publicly, for fear of being pummeled by his own side. And that, Moulton argued, is the moment you realize democracy is in danger, because when elected representatives cannot tell the truth, even about life and death, the system has already begun to rot from within. And while there is some hope that public opinion is shifting, fueled by the relentless replay of undeniable video evidence, Moulton remained clear-eyed about the resistance ahead, because denial, deflection, and absurd justifications are still being deployed at scale, including the claim that local officials somehow provoked the violence by refusing access, a claim so detached from reality that it barely merits rebuttal, yet is repeated anyway to muddy the waters and exhaust the public. And this, ultimately, is why voices like Moulton's matter, because they refuse to dignify the absurd, refuse to normalize the unacceptable, and refuse to pretend that what we are witnessing is anything other than a crisis of democracy unfolding in real time, a crisis in which federal forces are sent into cities not to protect, but to intimidate, not to serve, but to dominate, and in which loyalty to a leader is increasingly demanded over loyalty to the Constitution. And as the interview closed, the underlying question lingered unanswered but unavoidable. How many more videos? How many more names? How many more deaths will it take before silence itself is recognized as complicity? Because history is unforgiving to those who claim they did not know, and the images from Minneapolis will not fade easily, nor should they, because they are a mirror held up to the nation, asking whether America will choose accountability over authoritarianism, courage over cowardice, and truth over fear, or whether it will continue down a path where power is enforced at gunpoint and dissent is met with violence, a path that has been walked before by other nations who once believed themselves immune. And the only real question now is who will have the courage to stop pretending otherwise. We have reached a point where euphemism itself has become a form of complicity, and if this country is going to have any chance of pulling back from the edge, we have to start calling things by their real names, not the sanitized language of press releases or the cowardly half-phrases designed to offend no one while protecting those most responsible. And that means calling out not just the policies, but the people who enable them, especially the Republicans who know better and choose silence. Anyway, because silence at this stage is not neutrality but consent. And this is why naming names matters. Why figures like Tom Emmer cannot be allowed to hide behind party loyalty or procedural excuses. Because Tom Emmer is not some faceless ideologue, but a man known personally to many of us, a classmate, once regarded as reasonable, pragmatic, even decent. Someone whose own family members, people connected through quiet, private relationships, have watched him transform into someone they barely recognize. Someone who has traded principle for proximity to power, conscience for career survival, and who now cannot even bring himself to speak up for the very Minnesotans he was elected to represent, citizens who are being brutalized by federal agents operating with impunity on their streets. And this failure is not ideological but moral, because fear has hollowed him out. Fear of MAGA backlash, fear of Trump's wrath, fear of being labeled disloyal, and that fear has turned him into what history remembers most harshly: someone who knew the truth and chose cowardice anyway. And while Republicans offer endless obeisance to Trump and his movement, bowing and scraping in public, while privately admitting discomfort, the political cost of that submission is finally beginning to surface, because the American people are waking up, not through abstract debate, but through repetition, through seeing the same images again and again until denial becomes impossible. And when multiple polls, not one, not two, but nearly all credible surveys, show Trump's policies not merely unpopular, but collapsing under public scrutiny, especially on immigration enforcement agencies like ICE, DHS, and now even Border Patrol, the question becomes not whether opinion is shifting, but whether it will shift fast enough to matter before irreversible damage is done. Because democracy is not a self-correcting machine that runs on autopilot. It requires margins, mandates, and courage, and while this awakening will help, the scale of it is everything. Because what truly determines the future is not whether Democrats win, but whether they win decisively enough to prevent manipulation, sabotage, and post-election chaos. And it is still deeply disturbing that 30 to 40% of Americans support what they're seeing unfold: state violence carried out in plain sight. Because given the visual evidence, given the clarity of the abuses, that number should be closer to zero. And yet here we are, confronting the reality that authoritarianism does not require majority, only a disciplined minority and a fragmented opposition, which is why these midterms are existential. Because winning by a sliver invites chaos, invites interference, invites the same playbook we've already seen deployed, whereas winning by a landslide creates a mandate that is much harder to distort, much harder to steal, much harder to delegitimize, because it is one thing to pressure an official to find a few thousand votes and quite another to explain away a defeat measured in millions. And this is precisely why Democrats must treat this moment not as an inevitable backlash cycle, but as a referendum on whether the system can still protect itself. Because if Democrats cannot win big now, after everything that has happened, after brutality, the lies, the erosion of norms, then it forces an uncomfortable reckoning about the party itself. A reckoning that cannot be postponed any longer, because Democrats should never have lost the 2024 election to a convicted felon, should never have allowed themselves to be framed as the lesser evil rather than the clear moral alternative. And the fact that so many races remain close is not evidence of Republican strength, but of Democratic failure to adapt, to communicate, and to lead with clarity. And that failure is why introspection is no longer optional but urgent, because to win independents, especially those who voted for Trump once but are now unsettled, we must become something more than an anti-Trump coalition. We must become a credible governing alternative with defined principles, visible leadership, and policies people can actually articulate. And that begins with confronting the stagnation at the top of the party, because perception matters as much as reality. And right now the Democratic Party is widely seen as trapped in the past, anchored by leaders whose service is undeniable, but whose grip on the future is tenuous. And this is not personal. It is structural. Because when the party's public face remains dominated by figures associated with decline, delay, and institutional inertia, voters do not see renewal, they see risk. And this is why generational change is not cosmetic, but essential. Because a few bright spots since the last election, leaders like Abigail Spanberger, Mikey Sherrill, and Zora Mamdani, share a common trait. They are willing to challenge the establishment from within, to say openly that the old playbook is broken, and to speak in language that feels rooted in the present rather than rehearsed from decades past. And by contrast, the Democratic establishment has buried its own autopsy report, refusing to fully acknowledge mistakes, refusing to make meaningful course corrections, and continuing to empower leadership structures that signal stasis rather than momentum, even as the stakes escalate, even as colleagues literally die in office under the weight of a system that refuses to. Prioritize renewal, a system so brittle that a single delayed death altered the outcome of historic legislation. And if that does not prompt reform, it is hard to imagine what will, because the message voters are sending is not subtle. They want to know that the party hears them, that it understands why it lost, and that it is willing to change, not just rhetorically but visibly. And nowhere is this failure more glaring than on immigration, the single biggest issue of the last election. The issue that Republicans exploited with ruthless discipline, while Democrats responded with fragmentation and defensiveness. Because even now, when Democrats universally oppose Trump's immigration policies, they cannot clearly articulate their own alternative. And this is not a messaging failure, but a leadership one. Because opposition without definition cedes the terrain. And when asked directly what the Democratic immigration policy actually is, silence fills the room. And that silence speaks volumes. Because it tells voters that while Democrats know what they are against, they're still unsure what they stand for. And in politics, uncertainty is fatal, especially when opposition offers brutal clarity, even if that clarity is cruel. And this is why there is so much work to do, because time is short, institutions are strained, and the margin for error is razor thin. And even as domestic crises dominate, the international damage being done by this administration cannot be ignored, because the betrayal extends beyond borders, beyond headlines, into the lives of allies who once trusted the United States implicitly. And nowhere is this more evident than in Greenland and Denmark, where the wounds inflicted by Trump's rhetoric are not abstract but deeply personal, because when the President of the United States suggests that NATO allies haven't been there for us, he is not merely lying, he is erasing sacrifice. He is insulting the memory of soldiers whose coffins return home draped in foreign flags after fighting and die alongside Americans in shared wars. And to hear this from the Commander-in-Chief lands with particular disgust when that Commander-in-Chief is a draft dodger who never served, whose family never served, whose sons never stood shoulder to shoulder with Danish troops or any other allies when it mattered, because while American service members and allied forces bled together after September 11th, the Trump family made no such sacrifices, contributed nothing to collective defense, and yet now claims moral authority over nations that answer America's call without hesitation. And that hypocrisy is not just offensive but corrosive, because alliances are built on trust, and trust once broken is not easily repaired. And as veterans who understand what shared sacrifice actually means, who remember the names and faces of those who fought beside them, it is impossible not to feel anger at the casual cruelty with which that history is dismissed, because this is not just about policy disagreements, but about honor, about whether the United States still recognizes the value of loyalty when it is inconvenient. And when leaders treat allies as expendable and citizens as disposable, the through line becomes impossible to ignore, because authoritarianism at home and betrayal abroad are not separate phenomena, but expressions of the same worldview, one that sees power as transactional, accountability as optional, and empathy as weakness. And the only antidote to that worldview is sustained, organized, courageous opposition that refuses to be intimidated, refuses to be vague, and refuses to wait for permission to speak plainly, because history does not judge intentions, it judges outcomes. And the outcome of silence has always been the same, which is why this moment demands not just outrage but action, not just criticism but clarity, and not just electoral victory but overwhelming mandate. Because democracy does not survive on hope alone. It survives on margins wide enough to withstand bad faith, on leaders brave enough to tell the truth even when it costs them, and on citizens willing to recognize that what is at stake now is not a single election or a single policy, but the very idea that power must answer the law, that service requires sacrifice, and that fear cannot be allowed to rule a nation that still claims to be free.